Hello, and welcome to a brand new day of free-to-play here on Magic the Gathering Arena. Get the dish on the latest with me, Lord Rumfish. So, today the latest is green. Continuing the Deckbuilding Toolbox series for the Lost Caverns of Ixalan. And green is my favorite color, so I'm a little biased. That being said, there are some of the cards we're going to talk about today where I highlight that they're narrow cards. From a toolbox perspective, they could even be considered traps. Because if they don't serve a wide variety of roles, then they might be eating up wild cards. And maybe you never build the deck, or maybe you build it once and it's terrible. So, anyway, let's dive in. Cenote Scout. It's 1 green, 1/1, Merfolk Scout. It's uncommon. When it ETBs, it explores. You've probably seen this card a little bit on the ladder. It just seems like a great deal all the way around. You either get a 2/2 for 1 mana, and you have the option of binning something into your graveyard, or you get a 1/1 that drew you another land for 1, and that's a great deal. So I might eventually go up to all 4 copies of this. I definitely think it's worth it. Ixali's Lorekeeper. Now this one is for dinosaurs. Right, so we've got, kind of a Llanowar Elf type of a mana ramp piece here. Human Druid, 1 green, 1/1, uncommon. Mix a mana of any color only to cast a dinosaur spell or activate an ability of a dinosaur source. That's extremely narrow. The dinosaur deck is pretty good, but there aren't a lot of dinosaurs in Standard, and a dinosaur deck is going to be competing with all the other things you could be doing in Standard. So, if you know that you want to make the dinosaur deck and you love the idea, then this is probably a good enabling piece for that deck. You should probably go ahead and craft it. Otherwise, I would be on the fence for a while about it. Seeker of Sunlight. This card is probably just doesn't quite get there. So, Merfolk Scout's a common. 1 green, 1/1. It has an activated ability of a green and 2 colorless. Seeker of Sunlight explores. Activate only as a sorcery. Now, if this activation was at instant speed, I might talk about how you could pair it with the blue enchantment that reduces Training Grounds. That reduces activated ability cost by 2 colorless. That would be interesting with this card. It being at sorcery speed, though, that's a hard sell. You could send a lot of your deck into your graveyard. You could put a lot of lands into your hand. You could get a lot of counters on this thing if you make that combination occur. But there are already combo decks using that card that can just win the game. This would just be like a bunch of value if you turn that combo on, which might or might not win you the game. If you get a bunch of activations off of it, you'll get value, for sure. And you'll get a big creature, could die to a removal spell, maybe you got a bunch of lands first. Maybe you got a bunch of stuff in your graveyard. But if it was instant speed, I would be more excited. As it is, it probably doesn't get there. Twists and Turns. I'm a little bit unsure about this one. So it's a 1 green enchantment, uncommon. If a creature you control would explore, instead you scry 1 and then it explores. So you get to muck with the top of your deck as far as whether you want to hit a land or don't want to hit a land. And when this ETBs, target creature you control explores. So there's a little bit of value baked in for playing it in the first place. And when a land enters the battlefield under your control, if you have 7 or more lands, you transform this. That's not that hard to do, especially if you're trying a little bit to ramp. So you could certainly flip this over, and then it would give you another land. So the turn that you trigger this, it comes in untapped, so you've got the extra green. But you could also pay 4 and tap and look at the top 4 cards of your library, reveal a creature card from among them, put it in your hand, rest go on the bottom of the library in a random order. That's good value as an activated ability on a land. It's at instant speed. There's a lot to like about the Mycoid Maze. But is the front face of the card good enough? I don't know. You want a little bit of an explore thing happening. You also want a ramp thing happening. You'll hit your land drops as you're exploring, but you might not get to 7 mana until you get to turn 7 unless you make a concerted effort to force more lands onto the battlefield. It's an interesting card. I'm just not sure about it, but it's only an uncommon. Basking Capybara. I only mention this card if you're trying to make a self-mill deck and you don't have some of the rares. Right, there are a bunch of delightful rares that are 2-drop creatures. And if you're going to have green in that deck, like if you're going to run Old Stick Fingers and you're going to have green in the deck anyway, then this could stand in for some of the rares that you will replace this card with as your collection grows. And the other thing is if you make a giant pile of a deck that's like 200 cards or whatever, then maybe this makes the cut at that point. But mostly I bring this up for newer players who are not able to get all of the fancy rare 2-drop creatures that are all of the graveyard enabled things. This would be a 4/3 for 2 mana, as long as there are 4 or more permanents in your graveyard. That is not hard to do in Constructed. This will not be as good as some other Lurgoyf type creatures at its mana cost. But until you own those creatures, here's a stand-in. Explorer's Cache. This is a good card in Limited. I'm less certain in Constructed. It comes in with 2+1/+1 counters. Whenever a creature you control with a counter dies, you get a +1 counter on this. And you can tap to remove a +1/+1 counter, put it on target creature, only as a sorcery. So the card seems alright, but I would warn you that the card's a bit narrow. There are a number of things you can pair it with that just incidentally get +1 counters. And maybe that's good enough. You know, it's okay in an Explorer deck. But a really dedicated deck, where you got the Ozolith and things like that that are adding additional +1 counters as they fly around, that's probably where you might actually look at having this card in the deck. And I'm still not completely certain if it makes the cut into that deck or not. So, as good as it looks, I don't know if it's worth your time to craft it. Glimpse the Core. This is amazing. So, it's an uncommon sorcery, green and 1. You choose one. The first mode is you search for a basic forest card, put it onto the battlefield tapped and shuffle. That's like our Rampant Growth, except you can't do the other basics. I have been missing this kind of Rampant Growth type effect in Standard for the longest time. It always pains me when this effect is not there and you can't get this effect. Very happy to see this. But there's a second mode on the card. You can return target cave card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So if for some reason you have a cave in your graveyard, it's kind of rhyme, cave, grave, anyway, then you can ramp that way. And maybe you sacrificed your cave to discover, and now you're getting value back. This card seems imminently playable. The first mode is just easily what you want to be doing in a ramp deck. The second mode may or may not come up, but it's an option, and options are good. So yeah, just for the first mode alone, I love this card. If you like ramp decks like I do, you're going to want all 4 of it. If you're not in ramp, then sometimes you want to ramp a little bit in a mid-range deck. Or if you have green in the mix in your control deck, then you want to carefully consider what pieces you want to use for the ramp of your mid-range or control deck. This one's a little bit more of a hard ramp card, but the price is right at 2 mana. Could be a mid-range deck might rather have, I don't know, something that puts out a creature or something that can draw you a card or something that gains some kind of extra value in the process. But I think this card is an option even outside of ramp. It looks very good. Over the Edge, green and 1. Common sorcery. Choose 1. Destroy target artifact or enchantment. Well, you got a sorcery speed naturalize. So, alright. Mode 2. Target creature you control explores. And explores again. So, that could be pretty good too. You might get 2+1 counters on a creature, set the top of your deck a little bit. Or you might hit 2 lands, in which case, this was a draw 2 for 2 mana. That's also pretty good. And this card has the whole optional modality of blowing up an artifact or enchantment, which, from what I can tell, there are a ton of in our standard format. So, yeah, I think this card's very useful, gonna see play. Sometimes you'll find occasions where you use the second mode on this card, but I feel like the first mode, where you're just destroying artifacts and enchantments, is going to come up all the time. If you can make it to where both modes on this card come up all the time, that's when it's going to really be doing good work for your deck. Armored Kincaller. We have a 3/3 dinosaur. When it enters the battlefield, you can reveal a dinosaur. And if you do, or if you control another dinosaur already, you gain 3 life. This is not good enough for Constructed unless you're on a budget. If you're on a budget and you're trying to build a dinosaur deck and you don't have your collection very filled out yet, this is a perfectly reasonable 3-drop to gain you 3 life, which is a great play in an aggro matchup. It's a decently sized body, it gains you life, helping you to set up your later game and your bigger dinosaurs. You don't really mind to trade this one away. You will find better tools as you have more rares and mythics to throw at the dinosaur deck. But if you just want to build a dinosaur deck on the cheap, I think this is great. Coati Scavenger. This is a 3/2 for a green and 2 colorless. It's an uncommon raccoon. Descend 4. When this ETBs, if there are 4 or more permanents in your graveyard, you return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. So if it could be any card in your graveyard, it would be a bit of an Eternal Witness. Now you have to set this one up a little bit. And it can only be a permanent, right? Can't be an instant or sorcery, but overall, this card seems potentially playable to me in Constructed more so than it would be in Limited. In Limited, it seems like a kind of lackluster thing you may or may not turn on. In Constructed, it seems like you could definitely turn on the Descend to where this is always hitting. So it's always drawing you a card, and maybe a very choice card. If you've got like 10 or 15 cards in your graveyard, you could be almost tutoring for a card at that point. I think this could be better than it looks. Caslam Stone Tree, I think this is like a newer player kind of option. It's, it's definitely like a cheap option for a cave deck, but even outside of that, it's something that will probably find you a land. You look at the top 6. As long as you pad your land count out a little bit higher than 24, you're very, very likely to hit a land when you play this to where it almost never whiffs if you've got a higher than 24 land count. So most of the time you can count on this to ramp you, and you also get this artifact. Maybe you have caves in your deck, so you could eventually craft it into a 5/5. Maybe you have other plans for your artifact. Maybe you craft it with some other artifact. Maybe you sacrifice it for value. Maybe the opponent blows it up, and you find a way to get it back from your graveyard. Like this little raccoon. I'm not saying this card is great. It's not great. But it puts out a land for you, which doesn't have to be a basic. You get a chunk of a permanent onto the field. And if you happen to have some caves, you could turn it into a 5/5 eventually. I think if you're collection building still, this could be a solid card for you as you're, gaining your rares and mythics and such. Once your collection's very filled out, I feel like Standard has so many options for ramp at the 3-drop spot that this probably isn't the most competitive one. River Herald Guide. This is a common. Green and 2 colorless. It's a 3/1 Merfolk Scout. It has Vigilance. When it enters the battlefield, it explores. So this is, I wouldn't say any worse really than a bunch of the Explore creatures that we used the first time around when Explore was legal in the original Ixalan. And this might be better than some of the cards that actually made the cut and saw play in those decks. Standard has changed, times are changed, so is this card still good enough? Maybe. This is either going to be like a 4/2 with Vigilance, or it's going to net you a land when it enters the battlefield. A 3/1 for 3 is a creature that can trade pretty reasonably for you if there's aggression coming your way. It has Vigilance, so if you're in a position to be able to pressure them back, Vigilance is not a nothing keyword. It does come up. So this card is maybe borderline, but I think could be good enough to see play. This goes double if you've got an Explore deck kicking, then you might very well have this as one of your key cards in an Explore deck. I think it would be okay otherwise. Not amazing, but still, any card that can net you value, like draw you a card in some way, shape, or form, is always worth a little bit of an extra look. Spelunking. So this card is a little bit narrow, and at first it looks like it might be for a cave deck only, but that's not the case. It's a green and 2 colorless. It's an uncommon enchantment. When this ETBs, you draw a card, then you can put a land from your hand on the battlefield. So as long as you've got the land, and it does draw a card first, then it's going to ramp you on mana. If it's a cave card, you gain 4 life. And at that point, if you are doing the cave thing, then gaining 4 life is a good payback for playing this card. That probably keeps you from dying against an aggro start. Right? You're ramping, you're gaining life, you're moving towards your middle and end game kind of time. But this last line on this card that says lands you control enter the battlefield untapped, that's a really interesting bit of tech that's not just for a cave deck. Now, it works better with caves in the deck, But if you've got, like, I don't know, a 3-color, 4-color, 5-color deck, then you've probably got a bunch of tap lands. Could be the Streets of New Capenna ones. They could come in a lot of different forms, but lands you control enter the battlefield untapped. So this includes like the fetch lands, like the common fetch lands that we have in Standard, where you find a basic land and enters the battlefield tapped, but not with Spelunking. It's interesting. It's an interesting card. You're never behind on mana once you've got Spelunking on the table. All of your land drops are hitting right on curve like, you know, a monocolor deck would have. It's surprising how much mana this could generate for you by having them come in untapped over the course of a game. You wouldn't think something like that was very important, but it adds up. It gives you a lot more options. And I think this card is maybe better than it looks. Thrashing Brontodon. This is a good, solid card. You get a 3/4 for 3. So 2 green and 1. Dinosaur, it's an uncommon. It's a very solid bit of body on the table. It's kind of a going rate. There are a lot of 3/4s for 3 in green. Some of them have keywords, but this one's just an uncommon. And its special ability is you can pay 1 and sacrifice it and destroy target artifact or enchantment. It would be absurdly good if it was an enters the battlefield trigger instead of having to pay an extra mana and sacrifice it. But it's a very fair card, and it's a very good card. It's very solid. If you're looking for a little bit more utility and nuance in your dinosaur deck, then Thrashing Brontodon could be a great include. There are all kinds of silly artifacts and enchantments running around Standard. What if you could just reach out and blow them up? Colossadactyl. This is another one for new players. It's a solid body. A 4/5 with reach for 4 mana. Would already be a very stabilizing presence on the battlefield. 4/5 with trample for 4 is a very solid threat. Hard to get in front of it, hard to stop it. It's only an uncommon. It's a dinosaur, so it can fit the dinosaur theme. If you don't have all the budget for the mythic and rare wild cards, you could do a lot worse than to put Colossadactyl into your deck until you've got those fancy dinosaurs. It will save your life at some point against flying creatures and other things. So, good solid hunk of card. Eventually you'll replace it when your collection gets big enough. Walk with the Ancestors. I'm not sold on this card, but it's interesting. It's a green and 4 colorless. It's a sorcery, it's a common. You return up to 1 target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. Alright, so that would be way too much money. I mean mana. For a regrow effect. But you also get Discover 4. And how much you value the Discover 4 on this card makes a big difference. At a minimum, this card should be drawing you 2 cards, right? You should have a permanent in the graveyard to target. But you don't have to. You could play it even with an empty graveyard, just to discover. And you should also discover 4, and even if you don't want to cast the card, that should also go to your hand. So generally, this should at least be card advantage. You know, not at a great price, but if you are discovering something that is impactful in the game, you know, a removal spell that kills something, a large creature that now is a presence on the battlefield for you, as long as you hit something that's, you know, gas off of the Discover 4, then this card could be worth your time. It could be a totally reasonable play. The thing that it to be afraid of is once in a while, depending on the construction of your deck, is you hit a Discover 4 that doesn't impact the board. Now, most of the time that shouldn't happen. Most of the time you should either be able to remove something or add a creature or, you know, in some way impact what's happening. But if you don't, if you hit something else that doesn't change the board state really, that's where this card could be bad. And that's the reason I'm not sure about it. I like it, and I think if you've got a small collection, then this card will serve you nicely until you find some other things to plug in this spot in the deck. I like Card Advantage. Discover can be very powerful. I like regrowing things from the graveyard. I don't know if any of that gets this card where it's going. So, may not be good enough. Earthshaker Dreadmaw. We have an uncommon 6/6 trampler for 6. It's a dinosaur. And when this ETBs, you draw a card for each other dinosaur you control. And this is going to be one of the key cards of a budget dinosaur deck. And I have seen people running this on the ladder, you know. It's a good way to refill your hand to where, you know, if you've been committing a lot to the board, you play this, and even if they have a board sweeper, if you just drew 3, 4, 5 cards, you're fine. You get to, you know, keep going at that point. So I like what this card does for a budget dinosaur deck, but if you're not in dinosaurs, or you've tricked out your dinosaur deck with every rare and mythic you can think of, then you may or may not need this one. And Nurturing Bristleback. This isn't just for a dinosaur deck because it has Forest Cycling too. But we'll go ahead and read the rest of the card. 7 mana, it's 2 green and 5 colorless. It's a 5/5, it's a common dinosaur. And when this enters the battlefield, you create a 3/3 green dinosaur creature token. So you put out 8 power and toughness spread across 2 bodies for 7 mana. That is not bad. It's not amazing, but it's not bad. It's actually a somewhat reasonable play, even in Standard. And Forest Cycling means that this can make sure that you're hitting your land drops in the early part of the game. Do those two things combined make this good? I mean, basically it depends on how much you value the Forest Cycling. If you really like the Forest Cycling, then this body in the late game is very relevant. It's a very good presence to add to the battlefield. If nothing else, it gives you like 2 blockers at the same time. And in a dedicated dinosaur deck, you know, maybe you're giving them haste. Maybe you just come in for the win. Overall, I like it. Green has other ways to get lands, but it's neat that it's attached to this giant battlefield presence. And that brings us through the commons and uncommons. We can go ahead and craft up a few cards here. On to the rares and mythics. We're looking at a lot of cards today, but I'm highlighting some that are narrow and might be traps in terms of the toolbox. So, Jadelight Spelunker is not a trap. This card is great. You should be running it. It's a green and X. It's a rare. It's a 1/1 Merfolk Scout. When it enters the battlefield, it explores X times. What I wouldn't have given for this in the original Ixalan. I mean... Whew. So, the modality of what this is, what this does, is just amazing. Right? At the 3 mana mark, you know, if it had 2 power, it would be doing everything that a beloved Explore 2 card did in the original Ixalan. It has 1 less power than that card. But you can also play it on 2 mana. You can also play it on 4 mana with Explore 3. Explore 3 was basically unheard of in the original Ixalan. You just didn't get that. And up from there, it's your choice of what you want to do with it. You know, if the top of your library is like 6 lands, then at least you've drawn past them now. It might not give you the battlefield presence you were hoping for, but getting you past a giant pocket of land like that is also well worth your time. Be glad to have them gone. And they're not even gone, they're in your hand so you can use them. Gosh, this card just seems great. You know, I wouldn't love it at 1 mana or 2 mana, but anywhere from 3 mana on upwards, gosh, what a value proposition. You get to fill up your graveyard, get a bunch of lands, put a pile of counters on this thing. What's not to love? Just good. Intrepid Paleontologist. So, this can ramp you for any deck. It's a 2/2 for 2, human druid. Go in a human deck as well. You know, it's a rare. Taps to add a mana of any color. And you can pay 2 and exile target card from a graveyard. Now, that is some utility just on its own. Right? You've got a 2/2, taps for a mana of any color, exiles things from graveyards. It already doesn't sound too bad. There are a lot of 2 mana creatures in Standard, but, you know, this one would be in there, competing. In a dinosaur deck, though, there's more text on the second ability. You may cast dinosaur creature spells from among cards you own, exiled with this card, Intrepid Paleontologist. If you cast a spell this way, that creature enters the battlefield with a finality counter on it, so if that thing would die again, it gets exiled. Forever. This gives the dinosaur deck a lot of gas after a board sweeper. Now, if they manage to kill the Paleontologist, everything that you've exiled with it's just gone. You don't get to cast it anymore. Once the Paleontologist is dead, everything that it exiled is also just gone. But left unchecked. This card can let you just swiftly rebuild immediately with a bunch of giant dinosaurs with finality counters. And if they don't have another board sweeper in short order, they're just dead. The card would be fine outside of a dinosaur deck, right? It's fine. But there are other 2 mana ramp cards. There's even one from Phyrexia All will be one that when it taps, it exiles things from a graveyard. When it gets 3 counters, it turns into a 3/3. Oil counters. That card doesn't cost mana to exile anything from a graveyard. So, if you're outside of the dinosaur deck, you probably don't bother to craft it, even though it would be fine. If you're in the dinosaur deck, then maybe you look at crafting it. There are lots of other options. Growing Rights of Ixalan. So this card, I feel, if you want it, the reason that you want it is for the backside of the card, and that's dangerous. So what this does, it's green and 2 colorless. It's a rare, legendary enchantment. When it ETBs, you look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature from among them, put it into your hand. The rest on the bottom of your library in any order. And at the beginning of your end step, if you control 4 or more creatures, transform this. Now, if you're in a token deck, or even just kind of an aggressive deck, but if you're in an aggressive deck, this probably isn't what you want to play. Anyway. Maybe you have a ton of little mana creatures. Maybe that's the answer. You're ramping, you've got a ton of little mana creatures. You play the Growing Rights of Ixalan. You find another creature. Beginning of your end step, You have 4 creatures, you transform this thing, it's a legendary land, Ixalan, Cradle of the Sun. It can tap for a green, but it can also tap to add green for each creature you control, like Gaia's Cradle. So, getting to your end step with 4 creatures is not impossible. You can certainly do it, especially if you blitz out onto the battlefield quickly, before the opponent plays a board sweeper. And then, even if they sweep the board, at least you've managed to transform this thing. And you can rebuild and get a bunch of token creatures, and then make a bunch of mana with this. It feels like a piece for maybe a combo deck of some kind. Something that generates a really absurd amount of mana to some sort of game-ending effect. I don't know if all of that is worth it. It doesn't seem like the easiest thing to accomplish, but it's not terrible. It should replace itself as long as you have a very, very high creature count. And I mean almost every spell that's not Growing Rites of Ixalan in your entire deck should just about be a creature. And if that's true, then you should almost never whiff on 4 cards. Occasionally you will. Occasionally you'll hit 4 lands in a row. But, if you've got 30 or more creatures then you have very, very good odds of getting a hit when you play this card. If you think you can, find that deck building challenge, that's up to you, but I'm going to warn you that this might not be the tool you're looking for to make a wide variety of different decks. Huatli, on the other hand, Poet of Unity, green and 2 colorless, 2/3 legendary creature, human warrior bard. Love that she's a bard. She is a mythic. When Huatli enters the battlefield, search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it in your hand, then shuffle. And that line of text means that a one-of copy of Huatli in any deck that can make green mana is not bad at all. She's a Civic Wayfinder with 1 more point of toughness. But wait, there's more. Alright, I don't hate cards like Civic Wayfinder. I think those are perfectly reasonable. And a 2/3 body is not exciting, but it's fine when you got added utility like drawing a land. But she has an activated ability of red, white, and 3 colorless. 2 red-white hybrid mana and 3 colorless. You exile Huatli, then return her to the battlefield transformed under her owner's control only as a sorcery. She becomes Roar of the Fifth People. It's a 4-step saga. The first chapter is create 2 3/3 green dinosaur creature tokens. And so, again, she was already kind of good enough just for finding you a basic land. But now, she's got this option where as soon as you flip her into this saga, which you want to be careful if the opponent has mana open, they might kill Huatli in response. But if you can find a moment where they're tapped out to go ahead and flip her, then right off the bat you got 2 3/3s for your trouble, and that seems pretty great. Chapter 2 gives creatures you control have tap to add red, green, or white. That might or might not be that important. It's nice to have the option, but I'm not that excited about Chapter 2. Since I already love Chapter 1, though, Chapter 2's, okay, sure. Chapter 3, search your library for a dinosaur card, reveal it, put it in your hand, then shuffle. Okay, so now we need a specific other card in our deck to work with Huatli if we're going to be turning her into a saga. And it's nice to be able to use every piece of the buffalo, or the dinosaur in this case. So sure, if you can get some kind of dinosaur into your deck that you don't mind to have there to run, could be a forest cycler, could be anything, then you get a free tutor on Chapter 3. And then on Chapter 4, dinosaurs you control gain double strike and trample until end of turn. And, you've already got 2/3/3 dinosaurs from Chapter 1. You might have played the one you fetched up off of Chapter 3. And you might even have other dinosaurs that you've played if you're a dinosaur deck. Who'da thunk it? If your board doesn't get wiped between Chapters 3 and 4, then dinosaurs you control gaining double strike and trample is probably the end of the game. If you have dinosaurs and they gain double strike and trample, that's probably it. There's no more. Fini. Done. Double strike and trample is just so much damage. So, Whatley is good. Whatley is especially good in a dinosaur deck. But Whatley is not terrible even in a deck that doesn't make red or white mana. You could play her just to find a basic land and have a reasonable body on the field. I'd probably rather have her in a deck that can activate her to at least get the 2 free dinosaurs off of the saga. And that doesn't seem that hard either. I think Whatley can go into a wider variety of decks than just dinosaurs. I think she's alright. She's legendary, so I wouldn't tell you to craft more than one, but you could. Pugnacious Hammerskull. So this is a cool card. 6/6 dinosaur for 3 mana, green and 2 colorless. It's a rare. And whenever this attacks, while you don't control another dinosaur, you put a stun counter on it. So, if you don't have other dinosaurs, then this turns into a card that's like from, I don't know, 2003. Where it's like, instead of a 3/3 for 3, instead you have a 6/6 you can use every other turn. And that's like the kind of cards you would have back then. But what I will say about this is, first of all, it's a 6/6 blocker for 3. And if you're going up against an aggro deck, like, you know, red or white or something, dropping down a 6/6 on turn 3 is a big problem. Maybe white can move it out of the way with a Ossification or a Brutal Cathar? Maybe. Red is going to have a devil of a time with this card. Red, you know, most red aggro decks, the way that they're going to kill a Pugnacious Hammerskull is they're going to cast a, you know, Monstrous Rage or whatever it is onto one of their attacking creatures, and then also shoot the Pugnacious Hammerskull with like a Play with Fire or a Lightning Strike. And the creature that they put the buff on is also still going to die, so they probably just traded 3 of their cards for 1 of yours. And a lot of that damage didn't end up hitting your face in the process. So, if that's the kind of trade you force a red aggro deck into, how much more backbreaking is it going to be when you play another one? Or a dinosaur with reach, or, you know, a dinosaur with ward. So now they have trouble targeting it. This is a great spell, a great creature, and I'm not convinced that it's only for the dinosaur deck. I know what the text box reads. But it's such a good blocker. It's such a good blocker, that I think I would consider it outside of a dinosaur deck, and it's not a terrible attacker even if it gains a stun counter. Another dinosaur you could pair this with that you might or might not put in a normal dinosaur deck is Topiary Stomper. Right? So if you're in some other kind of green deck, and you want to survive against aggro, you can play this on turn 3 as your blocker. On turn 4, you can play the Topiary Stomper. Now you have the option of whether you want to swing or not. If you still need it as a blocker, that's fine. But at least now you've got another dinosaur in play. And you're setting up for, you know, maybe an Alpha Strike turn or a turn where they're forced to make bad blocks and they can't counter-strike you very effectively. Another deck archetype this card turns on, you'll notice it has 6 power, is Fight Rigging. This goes just fine into a Fight Rigging deck without any other dinosaurs being necessary. So the list of things that this does outside of just a dinosaur deck is, I feel, kind of extensive and worthy of consideration. So even though it dies to some removal, there's a lot of like red removal and stuff it does not actually die to. And this could be the tool that you need in your toolbox. Sentinel of the Nameless City, we talked about 3/4s for 3. Here's another one. So green and 2 colorless, it's a rare, it's a 3/4 with vigilance, Merfolk, Warrior, Scout. Whenever this ETBs or attacks, so you get value when it comes in, you also get value if it survives to attack. You create a map token. The map token, of course, is an artifact you can pay 1, sack, and target creature you control explores as a sorcery. So this card left unchecked will grow your board and draw you cards. And it's not a bad chunk of creature on its own. I like it. I like the 4 toughness, I like the presence on the battlefield, I like the map tokens it's generating. Just seems like a lot of good stuff going on here. I think I'd be excited to try this one out. Bedrock Tortoise. So, buyer beware. This is a narrow card. It has some interesting utility, but it costs a green and 3 colorless. It's a rare. It's a 0/6. It's a turtle. As long as it's your turn, creatures you control have hexproof. That's pretty good. That's just kind of generally pretty good. On your turn, the opponent can't target your creatures. So, if they were hoping to trip you up in combat with a removal spell, or something that shrinks your creature or whatever, or taps it, they can't do that. As long as it's your turn, your creatures have hexproof. They've got to do that on their turn. And that is interesting. The other thing this card does is each creature you control with toughness greater than its power assigns combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power. So the tortoise is actually a 6/6. Now, it's not a 6/6 in terms of things that care about its printed power, but being a 0/6, it's actually too big for a cut down. So you get a 6/6 for 4, and on your turn, creatures you control have hexproof. And if you have other creatures with more toughness than power, they can use that toughness for damage, for combat damage. There is a lot to like here. So much to like it almost feels like it could go in decks that don't care about just toughness or making defenders attack or whatever. It almost feels like it could go into other types of decks as a 4/4 that sometimes gives you blanket hexproof. Sorry, a 6/6 for 4 that gives you blanket hexproof. I don't know if it quite gets there outside of a Toughness Matters theme, but it's pretty good. It's pretty good. Plus, turtles are my favorite animal. So, I like what this card is doing. A while back, I made a YouTube video called Tough Love, if you want to look that one up, where I've got a Toughness Matters theme that I tried to use on the ranked ladder. it had mixed results. Now we have a deeper standard with more cards to pull from, and more effects like that you can put in the deck. So, even if one of your key cards gets killed, you have these additional copies that can do the same thing. I think the card is surprisingly good, but it doesn't like draw you a card or anything. It doesn't like net you any particular advantage. So unless the blanket hexproof ends up being like the linchpin thing for you, or just having a 6/6 for 4, then maybe you've got better options. But if you're in the Toughness Matters deck, then yeah, this is cool. Hulking Raptor. Hulking Raptor, you may have seen already. It's 2 green, 2 colorless. It's a 5/3 dinosaur. It's rare. It has Ward 2. And at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, you add 2 green. This, of course, is too late for it to trigger the turn you play it. But if it survives to your next turn, and it very well might because it has Ward 2, then it's going to give you a mana ramp boost of 2. Only does it pre-combat, but that might not be a problem if you've got haste creatures. Or other, stuff you want to do before combat. The card is very solid. Now, would it go into something that's not a dinosaur deck? Could you say, I want to use this as a ramp piece in my ramp deck to go from 4 mana to at least 6 mana, even if I don't make my land drop? I don't know. I don't know if it's worth it in that context. I usually prefer getting lands onto the battlefield. I feel much safer committing cards that ramp me up on my lands rather than mana creatures, which can get all, killed by a board sweeper. But I could see the argument for, once you've gotten your first turn or two of mana ramp in, that this is the piece that ramps you up from 4 to 6 or 7. Because it's also a threat. The ward protects it somewhat. It would be an interesting way to try to build a ramp deck. And nothing about the card, screams that it has to be in a dinosaur deck. So, it's good in the dinosaur deck, but it could potentially have applications outside of the dinosaur deck. I don't know that I personally would craft this if I didn't want to do the dinosaur deck, but if you have already crafted this card for the dinosaur deck, I would be curious to hear your experimentations with it in ramp, to see what you can do with it, to see if it's good in a ramp shell, where you just want to get up to Titan of Industry or whatever with a mana boost and another land drop. Cosmium Confluence. So if it weren't for the last mode on this card, I probably wouldn't have brought it up here. It's green and 4 colorless. It's a rare, it's a sorcery. You choose 3. You may choose the same mode more than once. So you can pick the same mode once, twice, or thrice. Now I want to skip right to the last mode on the card first. Destroy target enchantment. So that right there means that you've got this weird bit of niche utility with the card where it could blow up to 3 enchantments. And I don't know what kind of decks that you fight on the ladder. I come up against a lot of people who are still running, Wedding Announcement, cards like that. Or if you come up against the enchantments deck, you're going to have 3 targets. It's neat. That's a neat option to have on the card to blow up 1, 2, or 3 enchantments. So what are the other options? And here's where we get into the problem. Option 1, search your library for a cave card, put it on the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. Okay, so you have to have caves. Now there are caves that are common, cheap, and relatively easy to put in the deck. There's like the green Tapland cave, where you can sack it to discover 4 as a sorcery. And it might not be great to run more Taplands than you have to, but they're commons, I think, and you can then run this rare and fetch them right out of your deck. The interesting part there is that you could choose the same mode 3 times. So this can take you from 5 mana to 8 mana, even if you don't get another land drop. It could maybe take you from 5 to 9 mana if you hit that land drop. And that's a heck of a lot of ramp. So, it's a little weird because we're trying to use caves, but we could blow up to 3 enchantments. We could ramp ourselves up to 3 lands for 5 mana. And the second mode is you can put 3+1/+1 counters on a cave you control. It becomes a 0/0 elemental creature with haste. It's still a land. Now it seems like the weakest mode on the card, but I will say, if you're in a ramp deck, one of the things you can do is you can choose the same cave 3 times to make it a 9/9 with haste. So instead of having to spread it across 3 different caves where you'd have to have like 8 mana available, 5 to play this and then the 3 caves to attack with, it could just be 6 mana available. 6 mana available, 1 untapped cave, becomes a 9/9 with haste. And that's interesting. If your opponent is running out unprotected planeswalkers or whatever, or they've swept the board and they don't have fresh tokens to defend, then this card could come out and threaten to kill a bunch of planeswalkers of the opponents. Or it could just threaten to come in with a surprise attack for lethal. I think the second mode is the weakest one on the card, but it has play. It has play to it. And if you're running the first mode for ramp, where you're going to have some caves in the deck, then you might have targets for the second mode, which means it might come up more than you'd think it would. And as I got to thinking about this card a lot, I realized that maybe this card is good? It kind of looks like garbage, but the amount of value that this can produce, the amount of ramp it can create, the kind of hasty threats it can generate, I think I'm kind of excited to try this card. It looks like a dumb card for a cave deck, but you don't need that many caves in your deck to make it good. O'Hare Kazlim, Deepest Growth. 2 green, 3 colorless. We have a 6/5 legendary creature god. It is a mythic. It has trample, so it's a good sized body for the mana cost. 6/5 trampler for 5. Whenever this deals combat damage to a player, reveal that many cards from the top of your library. You may put a creature card and/or a land card from among them onto the battlefield, put the rest on the bottom in a random order. So if this gets in to hit the opponent, especially if it hits the opponent for, a lot of damage, if they're not able to block all the trample damage it's doing, they could be in for a very bad time. In the kind of deck that's running a card like this, you got other big green monsters. And you could get another one of them and a land for free. You could hit, Titan of Industry, some other big, silly stuff. It doesn't have to be a green creature. You know, it could be a Traxa, it could be anything. When this dies, return it to the battlefield tapped and transformed under its owner's control. So it becomes the Temple of Cultivation, which is a land. It's not legendary as a land. It taps for a green. You can pay a green into colorless and tap to transform the temple back into O'Hare Caslam. You activate only if you control 10 or more permanents and only as a sorcery. This one is not hard for a green deck to do. You might hit 10 permanents between lands and creatures, or if you're in a big ramp deck, you might just hit 10 permanents that are all land. It's not that hard. Now, if they exile this, then, you know, that's not cool, but it kind of protects itself from death, and 10 permanents is really not that hard to do. 10 permanents, I think, was what you needed to get the city's blessing in the original Ixalan. So all the way around, this is a big trampling creature that it protects itself from death and can keep coming back, so that's kind of a form of card advantage there, right? Can get you a free land. The free land can eventually turn back into a free creature again. If it ever connects with the opponent, it starts generating value. And in the way that it generates value is not just card advantage, it's board presence, it's mana advantage. So if you're doing that with this, then it's just phenomenal. But in the fail case, as long as they didn't exile it, I'm pretty okay with getting the Temple of Cultivation and eventually turning it back into the front face again. So I like this. I don't know if I would run more than one in a green monster deck or a ramp deck. It has a very good, you know, combat damage to a player kind of trigger on it, though. And I wouldn't mind using this with fight cards, because even if it dies, you know, like fighting a death touch creature or whatever, then you still get this temple on the back side of it. So I think this card's actually pretty good. It, you know, it doesn't like scream to me that it's like an amazing combo piece or whatever. It just seems generally solid and good. And I think I will probably end up running a copy in a bunch of my green decks. The Skullspore Nexus. So, it's 2 green, 6 colorless, mythic. It is a legendary artifact. So there's an obvious comparison in terms of the way the mana cost of this gets reduced. But I don't think this artifact is as good as the one people compare it to. People see the Skullspore Nexus, and they want to compare it to the Great Hinge. Right? The Great Hinge costs X less to cast, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. The Skullspore Nexus does the same thing. And it is 8 total mana, whereas the Great Hinge was 9 total mana. But this does not do what the Great Hinge did. Let's read it. Whenever one or more non-token creatures you control die, alright, so not if they're exiled, not if they're tokens, you get a green fungus dinosaur creature token with base power and toughness each equal to the total power of those creatures. So if you're having creatures die that are not tokens, this will make fungus dinosaurs, it cares about their power, not their toughness. And it makes one dinosaur equal to the total power of those creatures. So you could get one very big fungus dinosaur from a bunch of creatures dying. And this makes it somewhat vulnerable to a point-blank removal spell. Your other creatures, though, are protected from point-blank removal because they'll turn into a bunch of little dinosaurs along the way. The more interesting thing on the Skullspore Nexus is pay 2 and tap, and you double target creature's power until end of turn. That's the one that actually kills people. Right? When you get the Skullspore Nexus out and you have some giant trampling monster, and you double its power until end of turn, that's when people just die. I think this card, you know, it generates value in the form of, like, when your creatures are dying, it makes these big dinosaurs. And it can also pressure the opponent by doubling a creature's power. It does not generate value in anything like the same way as the Great Hinge. Right? Let's look at the Great Hinge for a second. So the Great Hinge, you know, reduces its cost in the same way, cost 1 more to begin with. The Great Hinge taps to add 2 green mana, you gain 2 life. Okay. So Skullspore Nexus does not ramp you, does not gain you life. Whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, you put a +1/+1 counter on it and draw a card. So the use cases of these cards is completely different. Right? The Great Hinge cares about non-token creatures coming in, and you draw cards every time that happens. It's also making your creatures bigger to start with. It also is ramping you on mana and gaining you life. The Skullspore Nexus is just not the same thing at all. It's trying to protect your creatures that are dying, which it may not accomplish if they get exiled. And it's also trying to increase your creature's power by paying mana into it and tapping to double a creature's power, which for that, you don't want like a bunch of little creatures that are drawing you cards and getting incidentally big. For the Skullspore Nexus, you want a gigantic thing that tramples and you want to double its power. And then, theoretically, you know, if that creature were to die in combat, then you get a giant fungus dinosaur. If the opponent has a removal spell, they'll kill your creature in response to you trying to double its power. You know, if they're forced into that position. And you're in a pretty good spot if you're getting, you know, fungus dinosaur value generating off of this. But it's just, it doesn't draw you cards, it doesn't ramp you on mana, it doesn't gain you life. It's not the same as the Great Hinge at all. And I am not at all sold on the Skullspore Nexus. It's an interesting card, but it's weird. And I'm not sure that I like it. And we've got Ghalta. Ghalta's back, this time as Stampede Tyrant. 3 green and 5 colorless for 8 total mana. You get a 12/12 legendary creature Elder Dinosaur. It is mythic, has trample. So a 12/12 trampler for 8 mana is actually about fair, probably. You know, by the time you're playing something that costs 8 or 9 mana, it probably should have this much potential to win the game. Ghalta does something else interesting here. When Ghalta enters the battlefield, and not if, you know, there's some cards in this set that have the clause if you cast it. That's not true in this case. So once you get Ghalta down, you can flicker it and the ETB thing happens again. You put any number of creature cards from your hand onto the battlefield. Now, that might seem like overkill, and it might seem like you're setting yourself up to get swept by, an exile board sweeper or whatever. But if those other creatures that are entering the battlefield, come back when they die, like O'Hare Kaslam, or if they're like generating card advantage for you in some way, like Sentinel of the Nameless City, or Huatli, where she like finds you a land. If you're getting like card draws and ETB value, like Titan of Industry blows up a crucial artifact or enchantment when you get it out, and it could put a shield counter on Galta. Then, as long as you're getting value off of all that stuff you're throwing onto the field, then it's probably well worth it. It might not count as overcommitting as long as you're getting some value in the process. Galta might be a little bit of a win more card, but if you can cheat this card into play, then you can get the ETB trigger. So if you like ditch this into your graveyard, reanimate it, then if you have a bunch of creatures hanging out in your hand that you haven't put in your graveyard, you get to throw all those onto the battlefield. Atraxa, of course. So yeah, there's some play to Galta, I feel. I don't think this card is just a meme. I don't think it's like just a win more to me card, get, killed by a board sweeper, whatever. I think this could be a game-winning enabler. Kind of in the same way that Italy is in red. This one is a little bit more proactive than Italy in some ways, because you're setting up your deck, your hand. You're not just getting like a blind something off of the opponent's deck like Italy does. Italy can, if you pay mana into him, you can flip him over into a bigger game-ending threat. But Galta, the next turn, okay, Italy would have to survive to flip over, right? If Galta survives to attack, with all the stuff that you put out onto the battlefield, that's probably winning the game too. So, I feel like Galta has some work to do. I feel like there are things to do with Galta in Standard. Might have killed the card a little bit if they'd, forced you to cast it to get the ETB trigger. But since it's not the case, you can do a Reanimator strategy and a bunch of different things trying to cheat Galta out. Or you can just cast it, and that's fine too. Alright, it's time to craft some cards. I'm genuinely curious. Cosmium Confluence, it looks like such junk, and yet could be the real deal. Enchantments are very much a thing. And it's not that hard to include some caves in your mana base. I am going to craft a copy. Bedrock Tortoise. I've already tried to make this deck before. The card's not that bad. Right? A 6/6 for 4 that gives everything you have hexproof half the time. Can't be that bad of a card. And I am interested in making the Toughness Matters deck. So I'm not going to necessarily tell you to follow in my footsteps. I love turtles. I already have 2 copies of this card. It just looks so good. Man, just okay on 2 mana, fantastic anywhere from 3 mana on up. Yeah. Sentinel just looks like such a solid card to me. I'm a sucker for, a green 3-drop that's like a chunky battlefield blocker that gets you card advantage in some way. Map tokens count. As it happens, I own 2 copies of Huatli. So I don't need to spend mythic slots really to craft her. She's legendary, you know. So I'm going to use a mythic today to craft O'Hare Kaslam. I just like a lot of what it's doing. I don't know if I would want more than one copy necessarily because it's legendary. But the card seems like such a good threat that just has this inevitability that if the opponent doesn't exile it, eventually, someday, it will defeat them. I like it all the way around. And that's enough crafting for now. So join me next time when we're going to be looking at multicolor, and that's going to round out the rest of the Lost Caverns of Ixalan. So, like, subscribe, check out my other videos. That's the big one, is checking out the other videos. And never stop honing your critical thinking and empathy.